It's a real delight for me as Bishop to be able to welcome Senator George to us this evening. The world's, if I may say so, one of the world's greatest peacemakers.
And I want to speak a little about him. As we know, he was a federal judge in the United States. He was a United States Senator and indeed the majority leader in the Senate of the United States for a number of years. He was the special envoy of the United States appointed by President Clinton to come here and to work in Ireland, and I'll come back to that work. He was the special representative of the United States appointed by President Obama for the Middle East and worked very hard in that very difficult climate. And he has been a successful businessman. He has also been on the board of a number of ventures, and he has his own foundation program for scholarships in his native Maine, and there is some connection also, he tells me, with scholarship here in Ireland, which I'm not completely on top of, and we may mention it later. I first encountered Senator Mitchell when, with Nick, I was in the United States and was fortunate enough to be invited to come along to the Senate of the United States and sit in the visitors' gallery. We were both sitting there quietly watching the proceedings when suddenly the majority leader stops the proceedings and says, I want to, at this point, welcome a very distinguished senator from Ireland in the gallery, Senator Mary Robinson. I nearly fell out of my chair. It was completely unexpected, and I wasn't well known at that stage, but that was the first encounter. Subsequently, George Mitchell came and had lunch with Nick and myself in Orison at the start of his work for Ireland, for peace, on behalf of President Bill Clinton. But at that stage, it was to organise a conference in Belfast, an economic conference, to prove that there could be a peace dividend, that if somehow people could lift their sights from the troubles and see ahead, it might be possible. And he said, yeah, and after that, my work will be done, really. But then in between that, I think, and the conference, which was a few months later, Bill Clinton cleverly and brightly changed the terms of reference. And the work was a bit longer than that. It was extraordinary work, extraordinary patient work, extraordinary work in bringing together the divisions, in listening. I asked a former loyalist paramilitary, Billy, and I won't bother with his second name, how is it that George Mitchell was so successful in his work in Northern Ireland? And he said, "Oh, President, he listened us out." And I thought that was a wonderful expression. He listened us out. And I thought that was the most incredible way of summing up the patience and stamina and courage of pursuing and coming back again to make sure that the work of the Good Friday Agreement would go forward and would build what we have. And now, of course, the message of Senator George Mitchell is even more relevant because of Brexit. He's somebody with an extraordinary authority to speak about the potential impact of Brexit and to advise on how to minimise any negative impacts. So it is with enormous pleasure that I invite Senator George Mitchell to deliver the 4th International Human Rights Lecture of the Mary Robinson Centre. George.
Over the past 2 decades, after the Good Friday Agreement, after the St. Andrews meetings, after power sharing, after the Assembly, much has been written about how Northern Ireland made the transition from war to peace. President Clinton, the UK Prime Ministers Major and Blair, the Taoiseachs, Albert Reynolds, John Bruton, and Bertie Ahern, all have received justified praise. But as I have often said, the real heroes of the Northern Ireland peace process were the people and the political leaders of Northern Ireland. At great risk to themselves, to their families, to their careers, at a critical moment in their people's history, those leaders summoned the courage and the vision to end a conflict that some historians trace back over 8 centuries. Recently, the people of the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. I disagree with that outcome, although I respect it as a democratically made decision by a free people. But I have conveyed directly to the United Kingdom's Secretary of State for Northern Ireland my hope that he and the other officials responsible for negotiating the terms of that exit will not take any action that reverses the gains made in recent years along the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I've had the opportunity to travel to every continent and to many countries. There are evil people in every society, but the vast majority everywhere want what we want: a safe and secure society, a decent home, a good job, and above all else, a chance to get our children off to a good start in life. This century may be, like so many in the past, a time of endless war, of famine, of oppression, of injustice. But it also could be a time where the dominant powers use their strength carefully and commit their people, their power, and their prestige to a great and noble vision: a world largely at peace, with freedom, education, opportunity, and prosperity extending to more and more people in our countries and around the world. That's our challenge. We must make it our destiny.
Speaking more generally about the arrival of President Trump, do you think the world is a more dangerous place with Trump as President of the United States?
Well, the world is, of course, a very dangerous place and always has been.
But is it more dangerous with Trump there?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. I don't support Trump. I campaigned for Secretary Clinton, but he was elected. He won under the American system. Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than he did, but in our system, which everybody knew in advance, it's an electoral process, and he prevailed. So just as I respect the democratically taken decision of the people of the United Kingdom to withdraw, I don't agree with it, so I respect the democratically taken decision of the American people to elect President Trump. Now, depending on what he does, it could be. But that's true of any elected leader. And the reality is, of course, that he's not the first person to run for president and to say things in the campaign that he doesn't act on once he's elected. That may even be true in Ireland. I will say this, it's a digression, but let me answer in one respect. The president has reversed his position on China. He's reversed his position on NATO. He's reversed his position on a number of issues. The one issue on which he has not reversed his position, which I regard as a danger to stability in the world, are his statements on nuclear weapons. He said it might be a good thing if South Korea and Japan and Saudi Arabia get nuclear weapons, then the United States wouldn't have to spend so much to defend them. That is an incredibly dangerous statement and would be very dangerous if implemented in policy. The United States led the world into the nuclear age, and we've led the effort to prevent the dissemination of such weapons with remarkable success. There are dozens of countries in the world who have the ability, the capacity to make nuclear weapons. And the vast majority of them voluntarily refrain from doing so in reliance upon the leadership of the United States and the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Were that regime to collapse, after taking 70 years to go from 1 to 9, we could go from 9 to 19 or 25 in a very short period of time, posing an increased threat of nations using nuclear weapons But the greater threat is of terrorist groups using nuclear weapons. That's the number one target of all these groups. And keep this in mind. Every nation has been restrained from using nuclear weapons by the fear of massive retaliation. Nations have borders, they have defined geographic areas, they have people living in those areas. But terrorist groups don't have that. They are free of the single largest restraint on the use of nuclear weapons, the fear of retaliation. ISIS is the only such group that controls territory, but that's going to be gone in just a few months. ISIS is certain to be defeated and expelled from Mosul and Raqqa, and they will then revert to the previously standard terror mode of sponsoring events around the world, but not having a defined territory and population. And so that's a great threat. And that's the one area where I believe the President's statement was most unfortunate. And it's one area where he hasn't retracted it. And I hope and pray that he will soon do so, as they've done in other areas.
Bringing it all back home, Brexit and Northern Ireland, and the thing we dreaded, that a border of some sort may have to be reimposed. How much of a threat do you see that to peace and progress in the North?
I think it's a very serious threat. When I first came here 22 years ago, the image of the Republic of Ireland held by many in the North was based on the Ireland of 50 years earlier. They didn't come here, they didn't want to pay attention here, and they didn't acknowledge the dramatic changes that have occurred in the Republic of Ireland in the years that most of the people in this room have lived. And you know those changes as well as anybody, a modernizing of a society that had been largely agricultural and rural. And I have to say, the image of people in the Republic, of some in the North, was a reverse image. It was difficult to get across the border, deliberately. Bridges were destroyed. And now, since the agreement, with the opening of the borders, there's been a dramatic increase in individuals going back and forth, in commerce back and forth, and when you're confronted with a reality, it's hard to demonize, it's hard to create stereotypes, it's hard to sustain those ancient beliefs of how different they are, how bad they are. And that will all be lost if that border goes back up the way it was, and you stop having people freely move back and forth. I can't tell you how many people I've met in Northern Ireland who lived a few miles from the border who had never been in the Republic. They'd lived their entire lives within a few miles and had never crossed the border.
And took pride in that fact.
Boasted of it. There continue to be internal tensions and difficulties in the North, complications. And I'm asked about this every time I go to the North. And my answer is, you show me a democratic society where there are not differences, where there are not disagreements and discord. I come from the United States. Anybody want to see discords in democracy, come to New York. We should not hold Northern Ireland to a higher standard than that we hold to other societies. You're going through a forthcoming change in government here. You've had a kind of a coalition for a while. That's going to change. The crucial point is this: are the differences being resolved through peaceful and democratic means or through the use of violence? That's the difference. Not that there are disagreements. Those are inevitable. Indeed, they're desirable in democracies. No, it's not a democracy if you only have one point of view or one party. So we encourage them, but we try to resolve them through democratic means, not through violence. And that has remained so far in the North. There is a tiny fringe on both sides who regard any compromise as a, quote, surrender of principle, who wanted everything 100% their way, and anything short of that, they're prepared to use violence. That's dangerous in a world in which one person with limited resources can inflict harm on anything. One of the, I mentioned earlier about the neutrality of science. Nowhere is that more evident in the capacity of human beings to kill other human beings. That's what makes this a dangerous world, because access to it is for everyone. But I have confidence in the people of the North. I have confidence in the public officials that despite all of these tensions, they're going to resolve them, even if you regard it as muddling along in a democratic way and not return to the violence.
I think that Brexit has posed a threat to a Northern Ireland situation which had become a bit more fragile. We've had the problem, and it isn't resolved by the recent election, of trying to get the parties in locally to come back together into an executive. That's still unresolved at the moment. It does not help at all that we have the wider issue of Brexit. I haven't met a single person from Northern Ireland who thinks that Brexit is in any way a good thing, even though the DUP formally voted in favour, although I think a lot of DUP members didn't necessarily vote that way. So I fear that if there is anything like a hard Brexit, and that may be the inevitable outcome, that it would be really very bad for the island, because I think the relationships that have built up, as George said, have been extraordinarily important, and the relationships between the two governments, the British and Irish governments, and if any of that is damaged by the Brexit process, it will be really quite serious.
Well, let me tell you just a quick humor story. After we got the agreement, I received literally hundreds of invitations that go all over Northern Ireland, and Bertie, the Taoiseach, called me. Would I go up to there was a bridge that had been destroyed just south of Enniskillen, near where the Sleeve Russell Hotel is, and they were going to name it after me, the Peace Bridge. So I went, and we had a nice ceremony, and I ran the machine that laid the first span, the only span. It's not a very big river, and then we had a little bit of a session where a smaller number of people were, and a local councilman was sort of emceeing the event. And then the Q&A, there was a lot of inquiry about my father. People couldn't understand how we didn't know anything about my father's family. I said, that's, in America, we look forward, not backward. So one guy got up and said, well, Senator, he said, my wife and I, we're in the business of genealogy, and we'd like to research your father and you know, to find out all about your history. And the councilman was a very sly guy, and he said to me, Senator, he said, if you pay them enough money, they'll connect you to Brian Boru. So that's my genealogy.